The creature's hand closed around the flat of Mira Halverson's glove with a strength that made her forget to breathe. Not the weak clutch of a dying thing, but a small, desperate insistence that pulled at the places in her chest she'd kept numb for years. Its skin was like cooled starlight under her palm, luminous and thin. Its cheekbones were carved too sharply for any infant she'd seen. Its eyes were not eyes so much as windows into something that hummed with distance, violet filaments swirling like nebulae in a jar. It made a sound like a question and a plea at once, and in that sound every calculation Mira had ever trusted unraveled into one irreducible equation: feed it. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The orbital beacon had been written off years ago, a rusted skeleton of solar fins and glass domes clinging to the edge of the observatory's exclusion zone, its telemetry flatlined and its maintenance drones reassigned. Mira found it because she was bored, and because boredom at the edge of classified projects breeds the same itch that once made her climb cliffs and stare into storm mouths, a hunger for something she couldn't quantify. She had not expected to find a child. Her glove tasted of paste and oil, the nutrient slurry she'd mixed from the med store, when the creature, small enough to fit into a foam-lined maintenance crate, had opened its mouth. It fed like a thing that remembered light, quick licks, then a shudder of satisfaction that made a sound in the hollow of its throat. When it took the last dollop, it closed its eyes and angled its head toward her as if listening for music only it could hear. Mira, whose life had been composed of experiments that demanded distance, and of nights cataloging the stars, felt the barrier shed built somewhere deep in her ribs give. She set the crate beside her knees, and, unscientific and unpracticed in mercy, but certain in one small prehistoric way, she lifted her glove to let the creature touch skin. The sigil woke across her wrist like a bruise from another universe, a delicate lattice of light blooming under her skin, silver blue and moving like liquid ink. Cameras in the beacon recorded only a waveform blip. Diagnostics registered a minute thermal spike. Mira felt the sigil as a pressure under the bone, a soft radial warmth that made her pulse quicken, and every neuron aligned to one truth she could not yet speak. The species had chosen her. Dr. Halverson. Elias Cortez's voice came through the facility comms like a measured blade. He was already on approach, the protocol insertion team having pinged him when the distress beacon linked to the old beacon flickered awake. He had been sent as a retrieval officer, an observer with clearance enough to secure any biological anomaly, and too much experience not to suspect that anomalies were never lone and never small. He was a man who had learned how to move through corridors like a shadow, and how to keep his face a mask until the moment demanded more. She could have called for backup. She should have filed a report and let the process unspool. Containment, quarantine, spectral analysis. Instead, she sat on the cold metal grating, the crate between her knees, the creature's tiny fingers still wrapped around the cuff of her glove, and felt the mark on her wrist like a compass needle spinning for the first time in years. When Elias stepped into the desiccated glow of the beacon, his silhouette was a clean line against the latticework of the old station. He had the stance of a man who had been taught to command rooms without raising his voice. His eyes flicked, to the creature, to the crate, to Mira. There was a flicker of recognition that was not professional concern, but old, sharpened worry. Dr. Halverson, stand up slowly and keep your hands visible. Mira complied because the words had become muscle training in a life of interagency politeness. She felt ridiculous and feral all at once. "It's starving," she said. "I fed it. She swallowed. "It marked me." The words were a confession and a dare. Elias's jaw tightened. He moved closer, the microfiber of his gloves whispering over the metal floor, and the light brushed the thin network impossibly woven into her skin. No camera tracer picked up the sigil. Her datapad's biosensor gave nothing but a normal heartbeat and oxygen saturation. Only she felt the bloom, the urgent choral warmth of being chosen. "Show me," Elias said, and there was an order there, tempered by the undercurrent of a plea she couldn't place. She rolled her sleeve back. The symbol coiled over her wrist, luminous and stubborn as a living thing. Elias swallowed hard, a warning tremor passing over his normally impassive face. "Damn," he breathed, which was not something he liked to do out loud. "You were sent to secure," Mira said. Her voice had a tremor she couldn't hide. She had read the retrieval procedures long enough to recite them in her sleep. Do not establish contact, document, secure. But the creature's hands had rewritten the rules for her body. Not to assess, Elias corrected. To protect. He crouched and placed 2 fingers on the rim of the crate, peering into the foam. The creature lifted its head, eyes opening to flare like tiny galaxies. It regarded him and Mira the way an orphan might look at thieves deciding the fate of an object. Weary, instantly sizing what danger might bring. "How many are there?" Elias asked. She did not know. She could not know. The data they had suggested no colony, no soft landings in the sector. Yet the creature's presence told a different origin story, one written in the margins of human maps. "I don't think it's alone," she said, "but I don't think the others are here. It looks like—" she searched for an adjective that was not human. "It looks like it was left." Elias's hand went to the comm at his shoulder. He hesitated as if hearing an echo from some alley of memory where younger versions of himself had hid behind doors. "You did the right thing by feeding it," he said at last. "But you know the protocol." "And you know I'd have called you if it had been an instrument we needed to bury," she snapped back, guilt lining every syllable. She was tired of being judged by protocols while living a life that taught her mercy as if it were a splinter. "I didn't call because because it looked like it would die if I did." "There are powers interested in biological samples," Elias said. His voice changed. The professional lilt returned. "Don't forget what we've seen in the files, Doctor. We don't get to make unilateral contact on things that can influence human neural patterns." Mira flinched as if struck. Neural patterns? The phrase had the sterile ring of an experiment stripped of flesh. "It's a child." Elias's eyes softened in a way that made him look 10 years younger. "It's a life form," he said. "We don't know what it will do if we let it integrate with human cognitive fields." She wanted to tell him that integration was irrelevant next to the thing that had anchored itself to her wrist. Instead, she put her palm flat on the crate and felt the creature's pulse thrumming like a slow meteor. "It chose me," she said. The miraculous syllables felt treasonous to the institutional ears that taught them both. "I didn't think species chose like that. I thought we observed them choosing, recorded their mating rituals, tracked their migrations. I didn't think—" "Species don't choose human agents on a whim," Elias said. His stare was a line of light. "If it marked you, Doctor, whoever seeded this sector, or whatever program did, might consider that a retrieval need. We need to secure the child and debrief." "Secure it? And what? Lock it in a lab?" She laughed, a brittle sound. "They'll dissect it and cross-reference every signal in its genetics to something they can weaponize. You know the litany. I remember the memos. You volunteered to carry the file. You know what they will do if they think power can be harvested." Elias closed his eyes for a half-breath. When he opened them, there was something else overlaying his training, an ache that belonged to a life before files, to faces he had traded for a dossier. "I know the stakes," he said, "and I know better than most that sentiment makes for sloppy missions. We need to follow procedure." Mira let the words sit between them. The beacon hummed with the distant resonance of old power rails and the creature's small breath. In that cramped place, the gulf between altruism and strategy yawned like an ocean between two ships tethered to the same anchor. Outside, the facility sun slatted over the observation dome, and somewhere beyond the beacon, the exclusion zone pressed against space like a held breath. The creature lifted its head and made that sound again, a tiny, mechanical plea that broke through Mira's defenses like sunlight through frost. Elias watched her hands, the way she unconsciously reached for the sigil as if it were an ember she could smother with her palm, and something in him unclenched. He had been taught to secure things. He had also been taught how to read the line on someone's face where they decided to act humanly in spite of orders. "Show me if it responds to your touch," he said quietly. Mira hesitated. Then she placed her wrist, marked and luminous, against the creature's temple. The small body shivered, then settled, as if listening to a lullaby older than any language either human had catalogued. The sigil along her skin pulsed once, like a heart striking a chord, and a ripple of phosphorescent light bloomed along the creature's spine. It exhaled, small and marine sweet, and curled its fingers tighter around her glove. Elias' breath caught. "If that's a bonding signal," he said, measuring the word as if it were a weapon and an altar at once, "then removing it might kill both of them. Or it might sever a link we can't diagnose. Or," Mira whispered, "it might mean that the species put a bridge where we thought only walls existed." Her voice was fragile and vast all at once. What if they wanted someone who understood both hunger and restraint, and they found me on the margins? He looked at her, really looked, and in the quick calculation of his mind, a new risk hopped into place. That his orders might demand a choice between his career and the person sitting in the older woman's jumpsuit with stardust in her hair. He had followed directives that had cost lives. He had closed files that read like graves. His chest ached with a memory he hadn't told her, of a small hand slipping from his as he chose a file over a family dinner, of a child whose eyes had been the last thing he had seen before the door closed and his life swiveled into service. Mira read something on his face then, not the man he commanded to report, but the man who had already begun to feel allegiance to the fragile creature and the marked wrist that tied it to her. "If they chose me," she said softly, "then I am responsible. I won't let them cage it." Elias' muscles tightened. "You know I'm not supposed to let personal feelings. And you know I'm not supposed to let bureaucracy decide another life," she answered. Between them the air turned electric, a charge strung on the wire of danger and compassion. The creature made a small, satisfied noise and arranged itself so that its head lay on Mira's forearm as if nesting. The sigil on her wrist pulsed in time with its breathing, a living metronome. And in that rhythm, Mira felt a future yawning. A future with people who would call her a traitor, a saint, an ambassador, a subject. Elias reached out, not to touch the creature, but to fold the rim of his tactical vest, to move the equipment at his belt so that there would be room for decisions that were not yet official. "We report," he said, the phrase an anchor thrown between them. "We put this in the queue." Mira's laugh was small and wet with absurdity. "You could do that," she said, "and then watch the queue bury it." She touched the sigil as if to steady herself. "Or you could help me keep it alive until we know what they're actually retrieving." He met her gaze, the line between duty and something more fragile still drawn in the salt of his eyes. The beacon's ventilator clicked, the sound of machines breathing around them. Outside, the exclusion zone hummed, patient and enormous. For a moment, a sliver suspended between orders and instinct, the two of them stood with a skinny alien child in a crate and a brand on her wrist like a herald scroll. Around them, the world continued to orbit 1,000 things that would want to possess the little creature, and the mark that made Mira more dangerous than any weapon. Then the comm crackled, and the protocols they both knew like the cadence of their own names resumed their slow, humming insistence. The comm static was a hard cut. Elias killed the channel with a thumb before the voice could fill the beacon with orders. The gesture was small, almost intimate, and it struck Mira as a betrayal and a mercy at once. "We can't keep it hidden forever," he said, looking anywhere but at the crate. His fingers worried the seam of his glove. "The telemetry will register the anomaly. Someone else will trace it. There are scanners that comb this sector nightly." "We hide it differently," Mira replied. "We move it off-station." "We create noise, divert attention to a false positive on Habitat Ring 9. We can mislabel the feed." Her words tumbled out, reckless with the spur of plans she knew were borderline insane. "We are both clever enough to do it for a little while." His laugh was a short, wounded sound. "You don't understand. You're treating my life like a variable you can swap." He forced himself to meet her gaze. "If I help you, I put my file in a position that will be closed. If I refuse, I keep breathing. And if you refuse, you let them take it and study it until there's nothing left but a schematic," she said. The truth in her voice made Elias's throat close. He hadn't expected to be cut like that by someone he barely trusted and already, impossibly, wanted to protect. She stood and, with a movement that was both clumsy and tender, lifted the crate to her chest. The creature resisted for the span of a breath, then relaxed. It smelled faintly of ozone and something leafy, like a memory of rain on an alien planet. Mira's arms burned with the weight of it, and the sigil along her wrist throbbed in time. "We have to go now," she said. "Where?" Elias asked. The question was both practical and loaded. He had 1,000 maps of the facility in his head and a smattering of exits that could lead them into the less watched guts of the complex. But refuge was not simply a place, it was the absence of prying eyes and the presence of allies. And allies here were thin as oxygen. "Old maintenance tunnels," Mira said, and the words had the ring of a dare. "There's a hollow in Sector 12 they dumped when they rerouted the solar arrays. No cameras, low-grade alarms, enough room to rig a field." She moved toward the hatch as if she had made the decision 1,000 times. "We can buy time." Elias watched her for a long moment, weighing the surveyor's certainty in her gait against the danger of his own defiance. He pulled the comm from his belt and opened a private channel, fingers doing the motions of someone aligning with a past he had tried to forget. "If we do this," he said quietly, "we do it clean. No traces. We don't touch the public servers. We wipe the feed. Destroy anything that links us." "You mean erase the only proof it exists?" Mira's voice didn't rise, but it carried the weight of the years she'd spent recording truths so that they wouldn't vanish. "You're asking me to burn everything I stand for." He flinched as if struck. "I'm asking you not to get killed by men who would extract power from what they don't understand," he said. "I am not asking you to betray science. I am asking you to survive it." Survival had always been mutable in Mira's life, an equation to balance. She thought of the sigil, its silver-blue coils like a treaty signed on living skin. She imagined safe rooms with bright windows and biomedical teams trained to care rather than colonize. She imagined a child folded into blankets that smelled only of wash and sugar. But she also imagined the slow, bureaucratic scouring that would break this creature into data and leave nothing resembling mercy in the sterile trays they would store in the cold. "Okay," she said at last, and each syllable felt like parachute cords snapping taut. But we don't become thieves. We become protectors. We relocate it. We find someone outside the system, someone who believes in life more than leverage. Elias stepped back, eyes narrowing as he considered options. Names unspooled in his head like beads on a wire. The engineer who'd once sabotaged a commission to save a flock of migratory drones. A retired xenophonist with a pacifist streak. A black market handler who specialized in getting people and things across borders with no questions asked. "We don't have time to phone friends," he muttered. "We need to move." They left the beacon like two conspirators walking out of a church after reciting vows in a language neither of them spoke fluently. The corridors smelled of old metal and the tired, antiseptic tang of the observatory. Cameras blinked red at regular intervals. They kept to the shadows between service pipes and ventilation towers. Elias keyed open emergency panels with a dexterity born of years in the field, while Mira's arms cradled the crate like a holy relic. Each step echoed with the thought of someone finding them and of what that would mean. He could feel the old program urging him to trail his hand across her shoulder to remind her this was procedure, not romance. He did not. They reached the maintenance shaft that would take them beneath the observatory into the forgotten guts. The hatch required an override, 2 biometric confirmations, and an access code. Mira wiped sweat from her lip and, on impulse, held her wrist up. The sigil pulsed against the scanner like an offering. The panel hummed and then relented. The system accepted the unique energy signature as a biometric. Elias's mouth tightened. "You didn't give that to them yet. How did they—" "Programmers of sentience don't need permission slips," Mira said. "Maybe it's a universal handshake, or a trick. Maybe it's a mother signal." Her voice tumbled into something softer. "Maybe it doesn't matter how. It matters that it works." They slid into the shaft like ghosts. The air grew cooler, denser, laced with the scent of old oil and damp insulation. The maintenance tunnels were a map of the station's secrets. Cable trunks like riverbeds, pipes that ran like bad jokes about the architecture of necessity. They kept to the low side, aware that any sound might ping a sensor somewhere on the other end of the metal ribs. Every echo could become a tracer. "We should have a plan," Elias said, though the motion of his voice declared that he meant it as much to steady himself as to strategize. Phase 1, move it. Phase 2, Phase 3, contact. "You," Mira interjected, and the single word was a small, bold thing. "You help me without telling anyone." She met his eyes, and for the first time since they'd stepped into the sterile light of the beacon, there was no officer in him, only a man with a past that made him hesitate. "Can you do that?" Elias let the word land. It was absurd to answer emotionally when the stakes were procedural and possibly lethal. Yet, in the place where his file had met a small human life he had once discarded, something shifted. He thought of the child he had lost to his own ambitions, of the hollow feeling he'd woken to when he realized no file could replace the sound of laughter at a dinner table. The echo of that loss was a blade he had long sheathed in discipline. "Yes," he said, quiet, "I'll help you. But if we get caught, we get nothing. And if anything happens to that child," his voice cracked, losing its armor, "if anything happens, I will never forgive myself." Mira's smile was a thin crescent, fierce and breaking. "Neither will I," she whispered. Her fingers found his briefly as they negotiated a tight turn in the shaft. For a heartbeat, their palms pressed, a contact that was more vow than comfort, a touch promising complicity, and, maybe later, something more dangerous, than emotional surrender. They emerged into Sector 12 with tracks of dust disturbed by a previous life. Forgotten crates, a patch of old neural mesh, a piece of child's fabric snagged on a bolt. The light here was dimmer, more forgiving. Mira set the crate down and unlatched it. The creature blinked sleep-heavy eyes at them and raised a limb as if to reach for the sigil still pulsing on her wrist. "You're going to regret this," Elias said to the universe, and maybe to himself. He could feel the weight of potential retribution coiling like wires around their ankles. "We need supplies, time, a place to set up a safe field that masks biosignatures." "I can jury-rig a decoy field," Mira said, already scanning the area for things she could rewire. Her mind went through motions of instruments, chemistry, electromagnetic interference. She could lie to a lab with data and comfort a child with a lullaby. She could be bridge and shield. She would do it until there was nothing left to give. Hours blurred into a focused flurry. Mira crawled into service panels, coaxing dormant circuits back to hum, while Elias hunted down a cache of field dampeners and scrubbed any trail that might trace them. At one point, Elias paused, hand resting on a rack of old star charts, and he looked at her with an expression that was almost private. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "Why feed it when you could have called the station?" Mira's hands were greasy from the panels. She turned to him, face lit by the phosphor glow of a reactivated console. "Because I didn't want to let it die," she said simply. "Because there are rules, and there is doing what feels like right in the chest." Her answer was a map of the life she'd chosen, one of risk and empathy, of data balanced against mercy. "And because I don't trust the people who write the rules to honor what is alive." He studied her then, and in that look something shifted inside him. Not a policy change, not a cleared file, but a reordering of priorities. They worked in silence for a while, the tunnel filled with the low music of machines and the artifact's slow breath. Time frayed at the edges. The sigil on Mira's wrist pulsed with each solution she engineered, a living ledger of delicate choices. When they finally collapsed against a makeshift barricade of crates and drifted into a shared exhaustion, the creature curled across Mira's lap, small and warm and utterly trusting. Elias watched them both and felt the soft, dangerous bloom of something like hope. He had done the right thing, or the thing he could live with, and for the first time in a long stretch, he felt the hum of moral complicity instead of the buzz of dutiful compliance. But the facility did not remain patient. Somewhere above them, a server pinged, and down a corridor, cameras shifted as personnel rerouted their patrols. They had bought time, not safety. The sigil along Mira's wrist flared once, then steadied. It was an alarm and a lullaby. Mira tightened her hold on the crate, and Elias put his hand on her knee. Not to command, not to claim, to anchor. Above them, the observatory spun slowly, an indifferent witness to the small rebellion unfurling beneath its bones. The next hours would be a negotiation of courage, trust, and sacrifice. Whatever choice they made next would ripple outward, in corridors, in files, in a species politics, and the echoes would reach farther than the two of them could imagine. At the mouth of the tunnel, a distant tread thudded. It was not a footfall measured by protocol. It was human, too steady to be a drone, and it carried with it the weight of inevitability. "Someone's coming," Elias said. Mira pressed the sigil with her thumb, as if to feel the heartbeat beneath it. "Then we either hide," she said, voice a quiet blade, "or we stand and tell the truth and see who survives us." Elias thought of the file he carried, of the child he'd once let go, of the dangerous tilt of affection he felt toward the woman with the living mark on her wrist. The decision lay before him like a knife and a key. "Then we stand," he answered, and the word hung between them, fierce enough to make the creature raise its head and open its galaxy eyes. It was a decision that would pivot everything: policy into personhood, custody into kinship, duty into love. The tunnel held its breath with them as steps grew louder, and above the low hum of the station, the sigil on Mira's wrist pulsed, steady as a promise. The footsteps were not alone when they reached the shaft mouth. They carried a rhythm that suggested two people in step, the measured silence of professionals practiced at making thunder feel like a whisper. Mira flattened herself against the crates, the child's warm weight a soft burden against her ribs. Elias slid a hand to his holster, not out of threat, but muscle memory. He did not draw. Whoever came would decide what kind of fracture the world would bear. A voice slid into the tunnel, low and rubbed with authority. "Elias, I told you to check in." The voice was a soft scythe. The man who stepped into the dim light wore the coat of the directorate's field liaison, Colonel Vargas, older than his badge but not older than his purpose. Behind him, two corridor officers in gray moved like shadows, helmets tucked to their sides, eyes calculating. Vargas's gaze found Mira first, then the crate. His face did not change the way a map does not change when you find new land. He adjusted his borders with a calm that was almost clinical. "You know you were not authorized to be in the exclusion zone, agent," he said, and his tone folded 1,000 reprimands into one sentence. Elias' jaw tightened. "We were doing an assessment, Colonel," he said. "We located an anomalous life form. I was ensuring security." Vargas's eyes flicked to the sigil on Mira's wrist, and the colonel's professional mask slipped in a way that revealed appetite underneath, an instinctive greed for possible advantage. "Is that what you call it? A life form?" He stepped closer, and the light caught the sigil in a way that made it brood. The mark reacted, a tremor of luminescence that was not merely biological but political, an announcement to eyes that wanted leverage. Vargas smiled, thin and quick. "Interesting." Mira felt the crate tighten beneath her hands, as if the little body understood the angle of hunger before it was spoken. "You can't just take it," she said. "It bonded to me." "You would." "We secure anomalies," Vargas said. "We ensure humanity's safety. We do not allow unregulated exposure to unknown biosignatures." His voice was the sound of locks being turned. "Dr. Halverson, I will need you to hand over any samples, records, and devices related to this event." Something like grief crossed Elias's features. He had rehearsed the conversation in cleaner arithmetic. Contain, sanitize, debrief. But the look in Vargas's eyes unspooled the honesty of their danger. "Colonel," he began, then stopped. His mind skittered over margins of memory he had sealed for quiet nights. A directive he had once carried out for the directorate. A child left behind when maps of resource allocation had been redrawn. He had thought those ghosts were behind him, mapped into the file of duty. But the sigil pulsing in Mira's flesh opened every long-locked cabinet. "No," Mira said before Elias could answer. The word was a small, hot stone. "You don't get to take it." Vargas's smile sharpened. "Doctor, with respect, you're not in a position to negotiate custody of an extraterrestrial organism. The directorate will assume custody until we can determine the scope of whatever." He gestured with elegant contempt. "This is." Elias's hand tightened on the crates as if he could crush paper into concession. "Colonel, if you take it, you risk its life," he said. "If it's bonded, extraction could kill it. You may not even be aware." "Then it's all the more reason we take it," Vargas interrupted. "We have specialists, we have containment. We will open it up," Mira said, voice breaking, "and call it research while you burn its history into schematics. You will call it progress. I won't let you make it into a weapon." Her face was the color of a rock that had been submerged too long. The words were a defiance she had written in the margins of her career. Vargas's eyes narrowed, the man folding an axe out of a smile. "Dr. Halverson, you are being dramatic." Emotions have no place in security protocols. Elias saw the colors of the conversation shift. Vargas had wanted the mark. He wanted custody. He had the badge to activate 100 doors. The fracture that formed was not only between Mira and the Directorate, it was forming between Mira and Elias in a more intimate geometry. Elias had to choose. Uphold the law he'd breathed with his first file, or stand with the woman whose wrist now carried the weight of cosmic attention. He tried to find leverage in the word procedures. "Colonel, we can mediate," he said. "We can set up observation rooms, controlled access, a neutral committee." Vargas smiled like a man offered a lesser tax. "No, we do not negotiate in public. We secure, process, and, if necessary, determine the legal framework retroactively." He nodded to his officers. "Place the container on the inspection cart and escort the doctor and the agent back to the surface for debriefing." When the officers moved, Mira braced. She thought of running, of hiding, of the tunnel swallowing them. She felt the sigil flare hot and angry, as if offended by the utilitarian coldness of human law. The creature's hands reached for her, and the small sound it made was a plea that folded under the boots of men who had never had to name what mercy cost. "Stop," Elias said, louder than he had the right to be. His mouth had the memory of older sins, and his heart the weight of a choice that now had to be made in the bright, public air. "You aren't taking it. Not without me." Vargas's expression tightened. "You do not get to." Elias's hand trembled. He had a file in his pocket, a justification for dozens of sanctioned moves. He had used those files before as absolution. The temptation to slide the paperwork into Vargas's hands and let the machine of authority make the choice for him pulsed in his veins like a ruined promise. Mira's eyes found his, and in them he read fear and a dare. Elias made the wrong choice in the first slow move. He handed the file to Vargas. It wasn't a surrender so much as an attempt to control damage. He believed that by putting the legal weight on the table, he could shepherd the process, keep the Directorate honest. He didn't see that evil wears a bureaucratic face and insists on documentation as a means to sterilize conscience. "Good," Vargas said, fingers closing on the folder as if sealing a fate. "You will accompany us for debrief." Dr. Halverson stepped back from the crate. Mira's laugh was a wire drawn tight. Elias. The name was not a plea now, but a charge. He had set the terms by surrendering his agency to a file he had been taught to worship. Elias hesitated at the sight of the raw betrayal in her face. He thought of the child he'd once let go for a dossier's completion, of the sound of a door locking on a family because a job had demanded a file. He had meant to prevent harm. Instead, he'd summoned a different harm. The past had been an echo. Now, it was a living disclosure. "He gave it away," Mira said, and her voice broke a piece of him like glass. The crack in their alliance was incandescent. "You promised." He couldn't find the sentence that would stitch this wound. It was not just that he had ceded control. It was that he had handed her fate to men who would follow the ledger over the living. Before Elias could remedy the situation, the creature made a sound that was not quite a cry, but a chord. The sigil on Mira's wrist leapt, silver-blue arrows arcing as if in warning. The light spilled up the walls and into the eyes of the officers. It made the air taste metallic and old. The child shifted in the crate, and for a fraction of a breath, the carved cheekbones softened, as if the creature listened to something beyond the tunnel. Vargas's hand tightened on the folder. "Seal the crate and prepare for transport. Any attempts at obstruction will be handled as interference with Directorate operations." Elias could see where the line had been drawn, and the man in him who had lived by rules raised the shield of procedure to defend a choice that had already splintered. "Well, escort it to Containment Bay 3, he said, and the words landed like cold bricks. He had wanted to steer the ship. Instead, he piloted it into lockstep with the people who believed they owned the map of right. Mira's eyes were wet, not with the child's danger alone, but with the sting of intimacy broken. "You promised me," she said, each word a small detonator. "You promised you'd protect it. You promised we'd find another way." Elias's throat closed on apologies that would not unmake the gesture of his hand. "I thought," he began, "I thought giving them a path would spare them wholesale aggression." "You handed them the key," Mira said. "You chose the courthouse over the cradle." Elias couldn't defend the calculus. He had misread the geometry of trust. In seeking to protect by pattern, he'd betrayed the person who had trusted him at his human center. The fracture was not a simple break, but a complex rending. She would no longer see him as the man who could carry a child to safety by bending rules. He had become the repository of the same institution that would raise what she had swaddled in her arms. As the officer sealed the crate, the child reached with a small hand and pressed against Mira's wrist. And in that touch, the sigil flared bright enough to blanch skin. Mira's cry was both animal and human. The light washed the faces in the tunnel and, impossibly, brought a ripple, voices in the distance, answering with a tone like instruments warming. It was as if the marking was a signal flare no machine could ignore. Vargas gave the orders, crisp and exact. "Take them both," he said. "Secure the doctor for questioning. Agent Cortez, you will be placed on suspension pending internal review." The announcement was a corroding oil slick over something harder than duty, Eli's sense of self. He had imagined this possibility and thought he'd planned around it. He had not planned for the way Mira's eyes would become knives when she looked at him. They cuffed their hands, not roughly, but with the certainty of bureaucracy. Mira's arms cramped under the weight of the crate. Eli's breath came quick and thin. The officers moved them, and as they turned, Mira's gaze slipped to Eli's, edged with a grief and a fury that would carve new trenches in him. "You could have run with me," she said, the words raw. "You could have been human." "I tried to be careful," he answered. "I tried to—" "To what?" she snapped. "To manage it for them?" The tunnel seemed to fold their voices into itself. The echo took the shape of a verdict neither wanted. Above them, the observatory systems pinged into a higher attentiveness. Somewhere, a screen went bright with the proof the directorate needed, images of a marked wrist, of a child in a crate, of a man who had given them the paperwork. Eli's eyes found the child for a second, a look of apology so deep it might have been a prayer. The child blinked, galaxy eyes dulling as sedation protocols began to be readied. It pressed again against Mira's wrist, and the light that spilled then was not only a storm of signal, but a language. It wrote into the air the outline of choices not yet made. They led her and Eli out of the tunnel. The crate clattered after them, its latch humming like a heart under glass. For a moment, as they stepped into the bright corridors of policy and power, Eli felt his past converge on his present until the seams burst. He had tried to be an instrument of order, instead had become the instrument of a fracture that would echo into things no file could contain. As the doors sealed behind them, Mira watched the sigil on her wrist pulse with a slow, terrible patience. The mark had chosen her, but choice had meant exposure. The species had signed her into a role that would make enemies in corridors of authority and allies in places no human law had yet carved. Elias's betrayal was a fracture that would hurt for years. The directorate's custody would be a fracture that might hurt for species. Both would leave her with scars that didn't show on scans. They walked into the light of interrogation rooms and cameras and the relentless churn of a system eager to turn mystery into commodity. Between Mira and Elias, a trust the size of a planet broke quietly, cleanly, and left them with two separate kinds of sorrow. The sorrow of what they'd failed to protect, and the sorrow of what they had forfeited between themselves. The sigil thrummed once more, a pulse that seemed to echo in Mira's marrow. It was a living thing, an accusation, a benediction. She pressed her thumb to it, feeling it answer like a heartbeat. Outside, beyond the sterile panes, footsteps fractured into 100 conspiracies. The world rearranged itself in the small moments that followed, each movement a rearrangement of loyalty and power. And as they were led away, one into custody, the other under suspension, the little creature's hand stayed pressed to the glass of the crate, a tiny, fragile anchor to the woman who had fed it, and now watched the world close around that mercy. The mark on Mira's wrist glowed steady, an indictment and a promise, and in the glow she saw the shape of something new, a duty that would not be mediated by files, and a loneliness that would demand new alliances. The fracture was not a single break, but a network. It would crack in corridors, in files, in a species politics. Elias had made a choice that would haunt them both, and the space between them, once small and electric, had widened into a gulf of policy and pain. The child's galaxy eyes reflected the lights of the facility as if to map the route ahead, and Mira understood with the blunt clarity of someone who had been branded that the road forward would not be linear. It would be jagged, it would be costly, and it would demand of her things the directorate couldn't authorize: love, recklessness, and the dangerous grace of choosing life over ledger. The corridor doors clanged shut behind them like verdicts, and for a suspended second Mira stood framed in sterile light, the sigil on her wrist thudding like a pulse transcribed into her bones. Elias felt the weight of the room settle on his shoulders, the weight of file cabinets, of precedent, of the one small file he'd handed to Vargas, and with it a nausea that tasted like regret. He had opened a door he could not close. He had given the directorate a paper key, but the heart of what mattered still beat in a crate at his feet. He stepped forward, and, in the trembling muscle of a man who had chosen wrong, he made another choice. "Colonel," Elias said, voice steady in a way that surprised him, "you can secure the crate, but you can't lock a bond in a locker." The words were thin. They were also deliberate. Vargas's smile thinned. "We can negotiate custody under observation, live monitoring, international oversight." Vargas tilted his head like a man considering a commodity's worth. "We do not bargain in public, Agent Cortez. The directorate determines policy." Elias met his gaze, and, with a hand that had once handled indictments and absolutions alike, he pushed his badge away. "Then put me under arrest," he said. "Suspend me, burn the file, but you will not take it in secret." Mira watched him, the arc of his surrender curving into a strange, sharp nobility. The officers exchanged looks. Vargas's hand hovered on the folder, then closed around it again with an officiousness meant to reassure the uneasy. "You both will be held pending inquiry," he said. "No contact." Mira's laugh was a thin, bitter thing. "No contact?" she echoed. "You want to put me in a room and study the mark until you can replicate it? You still don't get that this is personhood." The words made something in Vargas's jaw twitch. "We will assess its implications." It was a bureaucrat's hymn to power. Elias didn't wait for the sanction. He acted. He stepped between Vargas and the crate, a body unwilling to become obedience, and he did what bureaucracies never anticipated. He chose to be imperfectly humane. He thumbed the latch on the crate, fingers steady despite the tremor in his chest, and felt the small shape inside stir like a thing remembering arms. He looked at Mira and, in that glance, gathered all the apologies he had never spoken. "We'll take it somewhere safe," he whispered, "away from sealed rooms and people who only read things as advantage." The officer stiffened. Vargas barked a command. But Elias moved like someone with nothing left to preserve but a moral spine. He scooped the crate into his arms, and the corridor seemed to recalibrate at the weight of his defiance. "You're under arrest for interference," Vargas said. "Agent Cortez—" "Put the cuffs on me," Elias answered, before the words could finish shaping into procedure. "But don't take it." An officer lunged, another blocked. For a breath, the room hung in liminal arithmetic, the law's muscle pressing against the human expectation of mercy. Mira crossed the space between them and laid a hand on Elias's arm, fingers clutching the fabric as if anchoring herself to the one who had chosen her over protocol. Her touch was small and enormous all at once. "If you take him," she said to the colonel, voice steady like a scalpel, "you take me too." Vargas's eyes sharpened. "You will not make threats." "I am not," Mira said. "I am stating a fact." She smiled in a way that split the corridor into before and after. "You lock him up, you lose the man who knows the files. You lose the one who can navigate the machine without becoming one of its teeth. You clamp down on us and you force the species to declare openly what it has taught me in silence." The sigil on her wrist flashed at her words, a strobe of iridescence that made the room shiver. The creature inside the crate made a small, urgent sound, and in that sound was an answering cadence, an intelligence listening to the stakes and willing the humans to choose differently. Vargas swallowed. Bureaucracies are often fed on appetite for certainty. Mira offered him an impossible variable, the possibility of being judged by memos. "Well, take them both to Quarantine Suite 7, Vargas decided at last, his voice betraying the negotiation he had been forced into. "Pending review." Elias tightened his hold on the crate and let Mira's fingers stay on his arm. The contact was a promise folded into skin, a pact of fragile alliance. When the officers moved to cuff him, he let them, but he did not yield his eyes. He kept them on Mira, and in that gaze he sowed something that would outlast locks, the truth that he had chosen her, however late. In Quarantine Suite 7, the light was soft and intentionally clinical. Cameras blinked like watchful stars. The door sealed with a hiss that sounded to Mira like a countdown. They set the crate on a table and unlatched it together, hands moving as if choreographed by necessity and a shared fear. The creature blinked up at them, galaxy eyes steady. It pressed one small hand to Mira's wrist. The sigil shivered and settled into a steady glow, like a hearth settling after a storm. "Your mark," a technician said from the observation window, voice filtered through glass and policy. "It's radiating patterns we have no code for." Mira met Elias's eyes. There was no triumph in either of them, only the thin wash of relief and the rawness of what they'd risked. "Then we need to make sure it radiates care," she said, "not aggression." Elias knelt and adjusted the padding in the crate, fingers awkwardly gentle. "I'll take responsibility for the logistics," he said. "I'll be your contact on the inside. I'll fight the files." There was no pomp in it, only the steady, stubborn cadence of someone trying to atone. She looked at him like someone cataloging a miracle and a sin. "You don't get to save me with paperwork," she said. Then, softer, "You get to save it with presence." He reached and covered her hand with his. The motion was small, the world reduced for a luminous instant to the friction of two palms. The cameras captured policy and also a tenderness that had nothing to do with them. Outside, in corridors that would churn with committees and memos, the directorate would parse their choices. Inside the suite, a woman with a living brand on her wrist, a man with a file-streaked past, and a small alien child breathed in a room that might be the beginning of something illicit and humane. Hours later, as technicians conferred in hushed, bureaucratic tones through the glass, Mira and Elias sat side by side on the sterile bench. The sigil pulsed steady as a metronome. In the dim hush between them, words were not required. He leaned his head slightly toward hers, a motion that was apology and request braided together. "If they take you for study," he said quietly, "I won't stop fighting them." She tilted her face up to his, the mark visible like a comet's tail. "If they make me an instrument," she whispered, "I will become a bridge instead. I will use whatever they put on me to keep the child alive." He closed his eyes at the edge of her vow, and, with the small courage of someone who had learned to make fewer clean choices and more right ones, he kissed her palm, across the sigil, as if blessing a bond that would not be erased by policy. The gesture was private and perilous. Above them, monitors flickered with red lines and bureaucrats' names. Below, on the bench, Elias and Mira sat with a crate between them and a decision unfolding like a constellation. One of them had chosen wrong. One of them had chosen mercy. Together, they chose a road that would demand sacrifice, career, safety, reputation, but might yield something rarer, a life kept whole. The door beeped, and footsteps approached, official and inevitable. Mira laced her fingers with his, steady and small. "Whatever comes," she said, "we do it together." He met her gaze and, for once, let protocol be subservient to the fragile thing in his chest. Together, he answered. When the quarantine door opened and Vargas's shadow fell over the threshold, it found two people who had already made their choice. The colonel stepped in, and the room held its breath. Outside, committees sharpened pens. Inside, the crate hummed like a future. The sacrifice had been made in steps. Elias's file, Mira's mark, and now the true sacrifice waited. The surrender of safety for the sake of an impossible love, and the claim that some lives were not to be owned. They brought them into a hearing that smelled of recycled air and freshly sharpened memos. Vargas stood at the threshold like an accusation. For a long horizontal moment, the room assessed the three of them. One woman marked by a sigil that no censor could own. One man whose file had been both shield and wound. And a small luminous life that breathed like a sealed planet. The director's chair folded them into a conference of intent. Committees leaned forward with the hunger of people who believe power is tidy when measured in minutes. But the child, cradled still in a padded crate as if it might dissolve under human attention, tilted its head and sang a small sound that had no word in any human tongue. The sigil on Mira's wrist warmed under her palm like a lamp. The sound braided itself into the room, and in the thin seam between protocol and pity, something fragile and stubborn shifted, a human breath that decided, privately, to honor a living thing. They did not win every argument at once. The directorate put conditions, closed files, offered oversight and the soft, lethal language of control. Mira answered their legalese with a steadiness that was sometimes personal and scientific. She refused to allow the child to be catalogued into oblivion. Elias, stripped of ceremony, offered himself as a fulcrum. Suspend him, strip him of clearance, let committees convene, but do not take the child into secret labs where mercy dies on stainless steel. His sacrifice read like repentance and like a new kind of courage. Negotiation became a series of small victories, live observation with external oversight, a custodial agreement that named a human guardian and forbade invasive procedures without consent, a charter that acknowledged the sigil as an active bond, not a commodity. It was messy and bureaucratic and felt, to Mira and Elias, like winning in the teeth of an engine built to grind softer things into graphs. They paid in patience, in testimony, in the slow burn of career casualties, but the child remained whole. Months later, the observatory's exclusion zone hummed with a new rhythm. The directorate still watched, but the guard posts softened into a guarded truce. Mira became, awkwardly and inevitably, an ambassador, a scientist whose notebooks carried both data and lullabies. Elias took the fall he needed to survive, publicly chastened, privately essential, teaching committees how to protect rather than possess. They moved in the narrow space where policy bent toward mercy and where two damaged people rebuilt a life on the fragile architecture of mutual choice. On an evening when the facility's lights diluted into the soft bruise of twilight, Mira walked the perimeter with the child free at her side, small feet tapping against a grated walkway. The sigil glowed faintly under her sleeve, steady as a moon. Elias came up behind her, not in command but in companionship, and slipped his hand through hers. They watched the creature look at the stars, and for a moment all the files and hearings and betrayals fell away. The child reached for Mira's wrist, pressed a tiny hand to the mark, and the light that answered was neither a brand nor a claim, but an invitation, chosen, not owned. Around them the observatory breathed, indifferent and miraculous, and Mira let herself believe that being chosen had become, finally, a promise.